Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a war that still haunts the soil beneath America's feet. A conflict so brutal, so intimate, that even the ghosts of its battlefields seem to whisper in the night. You've probably heard of the great tragedies of the 20th century, World War II, Vietnam, maybe even Korea, and assumed one of those held the crown for bloodiest chapter in US history. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The deadliest war America ever fought wasn't overseas at all. It was fought on its own front porches, in its cornfields and churchyards, and sometimes quite literally, between brothers. The American Civil War claimed more American lives than any other conflict before or since. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm curious who's still awake for tonight's grim bedtime story. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in the sticky air of July 1863, somewhere near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The scent is a mix of gunpowder, sweat, and summer rot. Over the low ridge, cannon fire thuds like thunder, and each blast seems to rattle the ground under your boots. It's easy to forget, in hindsight, that most of the men fighting here weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, clerks, shopkeepers, teenagers with fuzz still on their cheeks. Many thought they'd be home in a few months. None imagined they'd be part of a bloodletting that would kill roughly 620,000 people, about 2% of the entire US population at the time. Historians still argue whether that number might be higher. Some say up to 750,000 when you account for missing records and uncounted disease deaths. But whatever the final figure, the ratio is staggering. Imagine if 8% of all men in America today simply vanished. Entire neighborhoods would empty overnight. The Civil War did that to the 1860s. What made it so deadly wasn't just the sheer number of battles, over 10,000 engagements, large and small, but the way old ideas collided with new technology. Officers, many trained at West Point, still clung to Napoleonic doctrines, neat lines of men advancing shoulder to shoulder, muskets leveled, flags fluttering. But by 1861, the world had changed. The Minie ball, a small, conical bullet, had turned the average musket into a lethal precision tool. A line of soldiers firing these could tear through enemy ranks like a scythe through wheat. You could stand hundreds of yards away and still strike down a man cleanly, or, more often, not so cleanly. And yet, even as the weapons advanced, the tactics did not. Generals kept ordering frontal assaults, sending men charging across open fields against entrenched enemies. It was bravery bordering on madness. But in those days, courage was measured by how straight you marched toward death. It's a tragic irony. The Civil War looked romantic in paintings, but in reality, it was the birth of industrialized killing. Of course, the battlefield wasn't the only place soldiers died. The deadliest foe wore no uniform at all. It came from within their own camps. 2/3 of all fatalities came from disease: measles, dysentery, typhoid, malaria, smallpox. Think about that. More men perished from microbes than from musket balls. Armies moved and camped in massive numbers, tens of thousands living in close quarters without proper sanitation or clean water. You can imagine the stench of latrines, the flies swarming over rations, the sluggish rivers doubling as both drinking sources and waste dumps. It's no wonder infection spread faster than rumor. There's an unsettling image historians often use. A soldier's life expectancy, once he entered a field hospital, could be measured in candle burns. One candle, about 2 hours, was how long many men lasted after surgery. The surgeons weren't cruel. They were overwhelmed and unprepared. Medical schools barely taught germ theory. Sterilization wasn't a word they knew. The same bone saw might be used for 6 amputations in a row, wiped clean with a bloody rag between patients. You can almost hear the doctor muttering, "Next, as another stretcher arrives. Still, some odd bits of progress sprouted amid the horror. The U.S. Sanitary Commission, an early civilian aid organization, was founded to bring basic hygiene and medical supplies to the front. Women like Clara Barton, later founder of the Red Cross, emerged from this chaos with reputations for angelic courage. There's even a quirky detail that makes you blink. Union soldiers learned to boil coffee not just for warmth, but to purify water, an early, accidental public health triumph. Meanwhile, the battles themselves read like a catalog of collective insanity. At Antietam, in 1862, the single bloodiest day in American military history, 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The cornfield there saw bodies stacked 3 deep, and the sunken road, later called Bloody Lane, was so filled with corpses you could walk across it without touching dirt. Yet despite all this, neither side broke. The war dragged on for 4 long years, grinding down armies and morale alike. You might wonder, why didn't they just stop? Why keep feeding men into what one soldier called the great slaughter pen of history? The answer, as always, lies in belief. Both sides were fighting for visions of America they thought sacred: union versus states' rights, freedom versus sovereignty, the preservation or destruction of slavery. When ideals clash that deeply, logic doesn't matter. Pride takes the reins. The quirky footnote? There were moments when soldiers from opposite sides fraternized, swapping tobacco, coffee, and jokes across picket lines between battles. One Confederate diarist wrote that he could hear Union bands playing Home Sweet Home at night, and his men joined in softly from their trenches. It's haunting to picture tens of thousands of enemies humming the same tune under the same moon. By war's end, the land itself had become a casualty. Entire regions were stripped bare. Horses, barns, crops, and forests disappeared into the war machine. And when peace finally limped in 1865, the scars remained, not just in the soil, but in the psyche. Historians still argue whether the Civil War's true legacy lies in emancipation, industrialization, or the cementing of federal power. But one lesson stands uncontested. It showed the world that even a young, idealistic democracy could self-destruct when technology outruns empathy and medicine trails behind misery. You lean back in your chair, picturing the flicker of campfires, the endless rows of graves marked only by wooden boards. It's a chilling reminder that progress, without wisdom, often comes at the highest cost. The Civil War wasn't just the deadliest conflict in American history. It was the moment America learned what modern war really meant. You wake up in the faint pre-dawn light of 1862, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp canvas. The camp is quiet for now. Only the soft clatter of tin cups and the distant whinny of horses breaks the silence. You sit on a wooden crate, waiting for coffee to boil, and look around at men who could be you. Their uniforms are tattered, faces hollowed by fatigue and homesickness. Some write letters to mothers they'll never see again. Others just stare at the ground, lost in the arithmetic of survival. The numbers are cruel. By the time the war ends, more than 620,000 soldiers, Union and Confederate, will be dead. That's more than all Americans killed in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. If you stood at one of the great national cemeteries today and listened, it would feel as though the earth itself were still trying to exhale the names it swallowed. Historians still argue whether this death toll accurately measures the true cost, since it excludes civilians who perished from starvation, disease, or displacement. Some modern estimates push the number past 750,000, and that doesn't even count the maimed, the shell-shocked, or those who returned home with lungs scarred by infection or nightmares that never loosened their grip. Every town across the fractured nation bore witness. In the North, church bells tolled so often that blacksmiths began melting down old bells to cast cannon instead. In the South, Entire counties lost nearly every man of fighting age. You can imagine walking through a small Georgia town in 1866 and seeing a single generation erased. Storefronts shuttered, porches empty, weeds curling through the cracks in roads once filled with laughter. The war wasn't just fought in battlefields. It invaded every household. Women became farmers, nurses, undertakers. Children learned to dig graves before they learned long division. The cost wasn't just measured in lives lost, but in futures unmade. And yet, in the middle of all this ruin, soldiers still kept journals, tiny notebooks tucked into coat pockets. One Union corporal described burying 5 of his own cousins after a skirmish near Shiloh, writing, "I think the ground drinks more blood than rain this season." Another Confederate private wrote home, "We used to pray for victory. Now we pray for rest." The staggering casualty lists published after each major battle had a numbing rhythm to them. Newspapers printed columns upon columns of names, so many that families began scanning them as if checking grocery receipts. Lincoln himself once remarked in private grief that each telegram of casualties felt like a nail hammered into the nation's coffin. There's an eerie symmetry to the Civil War. Roughly equal numbers of deaths on both sides, about 360,000 Union soldiers and 260,000 Confederates. But those numbers hide deeper wounds. For the Union, the losses were tragic but survivable. The industrial North could replace manpower. For the South, each death hollowed out a smaller, agrarian population that could not replenish its ranks. By 1865, Confederate armies were drafting boys barely 15 years old and men well past 40. And still, they fought. One of the most unsettling aspects of this war is how personal it was. Brothers literally faced brothers. The Crittenden family of Kentucky saw one son become a Union general and another serve the Confederacy. In Missouri, neighbors who'd shared harvests now torched each other's barns. You can almost hear the moral confusion in their letters. They weren't fighting faceless enemies, but people who once shared Sunday supper. It's tempting to believe that the Civil War's scale of death must have shocked its participants. But for many soldiers, death was an accepted companion. They posed for photographs beside coffins, swapped gallows humor about getting their ticket punched, and learned to march past unburied corpses without flinching. The human brain adapts to horror faster than we like to admit. Still, glimpses of tenderness broke through. Soldiers sometimes arranged informal truces to collect the wounded between lines. At Fredericksburg, one Confederate soldier named Richard Kirkland carried water to dying Union men for hours, earning him the nickname the Angel of Mary's Heights. It's said that both sides lowered their weapons to watch him work in silence. Historians still debate whether the story has been embellished, but its endurance speaks to a longing for grace amid carnage. There's also the odd irony of photography. This was the first major war captured extensively on camera. Matthew Brady's haunting images of bloated bodies and empty battlefields brought death home to parlors and newspapers. For the first time, ordinary citizens could see the price of war. One critic in 1862 wrote that Brady had done something no painter dared, shown the terrible truth. Imagine scrolling through those photos today. You might double tap out of reflex before realizing you just liked a picture of someone's son lying dead in the mud. By 1863, the sheer weight of the casualties forced both governments to innovate. Grim progress born from necessity. The U.S. Army Medical Department created new systems for record keeping, field hospitals, and ambulances. The Confederate Army, though chronically short on supplies, improvised its own networks of aid stations staffed by volunteer nurses. Some of these makeshift hospitals occupied churches where the pews were used as stretchers. Others were literal tents of canvas stitched from captured Union sails. Logistics became its own weapon. The North's industrial advantage meant that it could produce uniforms, rifles, and railroad cars faster than the South could bury its dead. A single factory in Springfield, Massachusetts churned out over 1,000 muskets per day. each firing the deadly Minie ball. In contrast, Confederate armories often melted down church bells or farm tools for metal. There's a curious detail many overlook. Most soldiers didn't die in grand battles, but in the lull between them. The marches, the waiting, the endless weeks of bad food and worse water. Those were the true killers. In winter camps, men froze beside dwindling campfires. In summer, they dropped from heat stroke during drills. One Confederate diary entry reads simply, "The sun is hotter than the bullets." And yet, amid all this suffering, there was music. Soldiers carried fiddles, banjos, and harmonicas. They sang ballads about home, sometimes rewriting the lyrics of old songs to fit the war's dark humor. When this cruel war is over became a kind of unofficial anthem. It's almost absurd. Imagine thousands of men humming lullabies about peace while sitting in trenches that smelled of death. But maybe that's how you survive. You sing, you write, you believe the morning will come. By the end of 1863, most Americans no longer asked if someone they knew had died. They asked who else. The war's cost wasn't abstract anymore. It was in the empty chairs at dinner tables and the folded flags resting on mantles. One fringe detail historians love to mention: spiritualism. The belief in communicating with the dead exploded in popularity during these years. Seances became dinner party entertainment for grieving families. Even First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln attended sessions, convinced she could speak to her son Willie, who died in 1862. It's a reminder that when death saturates daily life, people will reach for comfort anywhere, even in the dark. And perhaps that's why, long after the shooting stopped, the Civil War refused to end inside people's minds. Every scar, every empty sleeve, every photograph of a graveyard whispered the same truth, that the real battle was learning to live again. So you sit by the campfire, staring into embers that look like tiny suns dying out one by one, and realize the real cost of the Civil War wasn't just measured in numbers. It was the slow erosion of innocence, the loss of the idea that war could ever be glorious again. You're still in that camp, except now it's dusk, and the sweet rot of summer hangs low over the rows of white tents. Lanterns flicker. Somewhere, a fiddle stumbles through Lorena, that mournful tune soldiers on both sides hum when night falls. The war has gone quiet for the moment, but you know what's really killing men isn't silence. It's the invisible war inside every tent flap. You look around and realize the real enemy doesn't march or fire muskets. It seeps. It breeds in the unwashed clothes, in the stagnant puddles near the latrine pits, in the half-cooked salt pork crawling with flies. This, you understand now, is the true killer of the Civil War: disease. It's hard to picture just how primitive military medicine was then. Germ theory hadn't yet caught on. Most doctors believed that bad air caused illness, not bacteria or viruses. The concept of sterilizing instruments was as foreign as spaceships. When a soldier fell ill with dysentery or smallpox, doctors treated him with things like mercury pills, whiskey, or bloodletting, none of which helped, all of which probably made it worse. Historians still argue whether the epidemic patterns of the Civil War qualify as the first modern medical crisis. Some call it the great unintentional laboratory where public health was born. After all, nearly 2 out of every 3 deaths came from disease, not combat. The total body count from infection alone exceeded 400,000. Measles swept through camps like wildfire, especially among rural boys who'd never been exposed before. Typhoid fever lurked in the water barrels, and dysentery, oh dysentery, was practically a rite of passage. Diaries describe the misery bluntly. Men drop in the ranks, too weak to stand from flux. You can imagine that. Men clutching their stomachs, collapsing in rows, not from bullets, but from their own bowels turning against them. There's a grim irony here. Armies moved on their stomachs, but their stomachs were often what killed them. Food supplies were rarely clean. Union troops, despite better logistics, ate rancid salted pork and worm-riddled hardtack biscuits that could chip a tooth. Confederates fared worse. Many subsisted on what they called slush, a paste of cornmeal fried in bacon grease, eaten 3 times a day. Soldiers joked that you could tell the difference between Union and Confederate camps by smell alone. The North smelled like bad coffee, the South like burnt fat. And then there was the water. Imagine 10,000 men washing, cooking, and dumping waste into the same creek. You'd dip your canteen, take a swig, and never know whether you'd just swallowed someone else's infection. One officer wrote that he preferred whiskey to water because whiskey, at least, killed something. A quirky footnote: some soldiers believed chewing tobacco killed germs, so they'd spit into their own canteens before drinking. Others hung horseshoes or Bible verses above their bunks as charms against disease. Neither worked, obviously, but belief is sometimes stronger than medicine. The Union Army tried to address this with sanitation regulations, though enforcement was spotty. Field surgeons began reporting statistics about disease, making the Civil War one of the first conflicts to be measured medically. It's why we have so many precise figures today, grim spreadsheets of human misery recorded in perfect 19th century penmanship. The Confederacy, chronically short of medical supplies, resorted to creative solutions. In Richmond, hospital gardens grew medicinal herbs like foxglove and peppermint when imported drugs ran out. Some surgeons even experimented with native plants, dogwood bark for fevers, pine tar for wounds. It was makeshift science born out of desperation. Historians still debate whether these herbal remedies helped or merely delayed the inevitable. And yet, amid all this sickness, soldiers adapted. They developed what one doctor called camp discipline, an informal hygiene culture that involved boiling water, washing clothes weekly, and burning garbage pits. It wasn't perfect, but it saved lives. In fact, by 1864, mortality rates in some Union regiments dropped dramatically simply because soldiers learned to clean up after themselves. You might smile at that. Civilization rediscovered by men in blue coats scrubbing their socks in muddy streams. Night falls heavier now. You hear coughing, deep, rattling, like the throat of someone halfway between fever and prayer. The sound echoes across the camp, multiplied by 1,000 lungs. You realize that the war's soundtrack isn't just cannons. It's wheezing, hacking, moaning, and in that chorus, one voice goes silent every few minutes. Disease respected no rank. Generals and privates alike fell ill. At one point, even Robert E. Lee suffered from heart palpitations and dysentery so severe he had to direct battles from a tent. Ulysses S. Grant spent an entire campaign vomiting from malaria, surviving only because he refused to stop commanding. Imagine fighting through a war where every sneeze might be your last. A soldier in the 7th Wisconsin Regiment once wrote home, "We bury more men in camp than on the battlefield." The gravediggers have become the busiest unit. You picture that, the shovelers, weary and detached, carving fresh graves in wet clay behind the tents. Their arms must have ached more than the men swinging muskets at the front. But here's a strange twist. All that death forced progress. The Civil War birthed America's first real ambulance corps, with horse-drawn wagons dedicated to transporting the wounded. It also spurred the development of organized nursing. Women like Clara Barton, Dorothea Dix, and countless unnamed volunteers who braved infection to tend to soldiers. Barton herself once described washing maggot-filled wounds while cannon fire thundered nearby. The image lingers, the birth of compassion amid the machinery of death. A curious debate still swirls among historians. Did the Civil War accelerate the acceptance of germ theory in America? Some argue yes. Too many doctors had seen infections spread invisibly. Others insist it took another generation, until after Louis Pasteur's discoveries in Europe, before American medicine truly caught up. Either way, this was the pivot point, the war that made the nation realize that cleanliness could save as many lives as courage. If you were to walk through a Civil War camp tonight, you'd see ghosts of both tragedy and transformation. Over there, a young soldier scrubs his canteen, muttering that it tastes less of mud today. Over here, a nurse wipes her brow, her apron streaked with blood and hope. Beyond the flicker of campfires, burial mounds stretch like quiet waves across the horizon. And as you stand there, you'd sense something else, a slow, creeping awareness that this war isn't just killing bodies. It's reshaping what it means to fight, to heal, to survive. Before this conflict, a sick soldier was a liability. After it, he became data, an entry in the growing science of survival. You take one last look around. The firelight glints off tin cups, the smell of sickness blends with damp earth, and a faint hymn drifts through the night. Nearer, my God, to thee. You can almost feel the fever in the air, hot and invisible, moving from tent to tent like a whisper. And you understand now that the Civil War wasn't just fought with bullets or bayonets. It was fought with bacteria, with ignorance, with the stubborn refusal of a young nation to believe that something too small to see could kill faster than any army. You exhale, realizing that if you'd been here, you probably wouldn't have survived this part. Not from fear, but from fever. Morning again, and you're trudging through camp mud that looks more like chocolate pudding than soil. Every step makes a suction sound, boots sinking deep into the filth left behind by 1,000 men who've been living, sweating, and dying in the same patch of ground for weeks. You stop at a shallow trench where a few soldiers shovel waste, muttering curses about how the smell clings to them. It's not the scent of death exactly. It's the scent of rot, of water gone foul, of an army poisoning itself one latrine at a time. You remember that statistic. 2/3 of Civil War deaths came from disease, and you can practically see why. In this place, hygiene isn't just poor, it's suicidal. The camps were cities made of canvas and chaos. Tens of thousands of men crowded together without plumbing, without sewage systems, without understanding that the same creek they bathed in was also where their horses drank and where they dumped waste. The term sanitation meant something closer to maybe bury it. Every rainstorm flooded latrines, carrying contamination straight through tents and mess areas. Dysentery, known bluntly as the flux, ran through regiments faster than gossip. Soldiers joked grimly that their intestines were more active than their rifles. Historians still argue whether either side ever truly understood the importance of clean water during the war. The Union had the advantage of organization, creating inspectors and sanitary commissions, while the Confederacy often improvised with whatever it had left. But in both camps, ignorance was the silent killer. You walk past a cook tent where men stir something gray in a dented pot. It's a stew made of mystery meat, stale cornmeal, and river water so cloudy it might as well be broth. You catch the smell of spoiled pork and realize that soldiers were often fed food unfit for dogs. Rations spoiled during transport, barrels of salted beef turned green in the sun, insects infested hardtack so completely that men dunked it in coffee just to drown the weevils. One diary cheerfully notes, "We call them meat biscuits now." And then there's the water. Always the water. Most soldiers carried canteens filled from nearby creeks or puddles, some so muddy you could chew them. Union troops, with better supply lines, occasionally received barrels of purified water, though that usually meant it had been mixed with vinegar or whiskey. Confederates weren't so lucky. They drank whatever ran downhill, which, tragically, was often runoff from the latrines. A quirky fact: a few enterprising soldiers discovered that boiling coffee made the water safer to drink. It wasn't an intentional health measure, just a way to stay awake, but it accidentally saved thousands of lives. Coffee became so vital that Union soldiers mutinied when supplies ran low. Some even traded captured tobacco or buttons just for a handful of beans. You could say caffeine became the war's first public health intervention. As you walk further through the camp, the smell intensifies. Horses stand hip-deep in muck, tents lean at odd angles, canvas stained dark with mildew. A line of men shuffled toward a crude pit latrine with shovels over their shoulders. not to dig trenches, but to bury the waste of the previous day. The stench is unbearable, and you think about how it must have been during summer, when the air stood still and disease spread with every fly. The flies were more than a nuisance. They were the army's little undertakers, landing on corpses, crawling through wounds, then alighting on food. In hospitals, they covered open injuries so thickly that nurses described brushing them off like living blankets. Historians still debate whether insect-borne diseases like typhoid or dysentery killed more soldiers than contaminated water. But either way, the line between them was slim. One surgeon at a field hospital near Vicksburg wrote that he'd treated more cases of diarrhea than bullet wounds. He called it the constant companion of the soldier. The prescription? Laudanum for pain, chalk powder for the stomach, and opium to stop the flow. You wince imagining that cure. Stop the symptoms, ignore the source, hope for mercy. Despite all this, efforts were made to improve things. The U.S. Sanitary Commission, led by civilians, inspected camps, recommended drainage systems, and promoted hand washing. Radical ideas for 1861. They distributed pamphlets like Advice to Soldiers on Keeping Healthy, which suggested boiling water, airing bedding, and avoiding spoiled meat. Simple stuff, obvious to you now, but revolutionary then. The Confederacy, meanwhile, had the Southern Aid Society and countless women who turned their homes into makeshift hospitals. They cleaned wounds, washed linen, and improvised disinfectants from vinegar and pine resin. A Confederate nurse named Kate Cumming kept a diary where she lamented that filth and fever thrive where men do not care to clean. Her words could have been a public health slogan a century ahead of her time. Still, discipline was hard to enforce. Soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and superstitious. Many believed disease came from miasma, a poisonous fog. Some burned sulfur or hung garlic around their necks. Others carried lucky coins or rabbit feet. One private in a Virginia regiment swore that placing a Bible under your pillow warded off cholera. You wonder if maybe faith itself was their only defense. A small number of doctors began noticing patterns. They saw that regiments with cleaner camps suffered fewer deaths. One Union medical officer, Jonathan Letterman, who would later revolutionize battlefield evacuation, pushed for better camp hygiene as fiercely as he pushed for surgical reform. He argued that every bucket of clean water saved more soldiers than a dozen surgeons could. His reports were ignored at first, but by 1864, even the most stubborn generals had learned that bad water was as deadly as bad orders. Here's a curious detail. Soldiers often bathed naked in rivers near the front lines, laughing and splashing like schoolboys. But sometimes the enemy saw the commotion and opened fire. There are records of entire platoons caught mid-bath during surprise attacks. Imagine being shot while trying to wash the grime of disease from your skin. One final insult in a war where death never gave you privacy. When you finally reach the far edge of camp, you find the hospital tents. They're lined with straw, buzzing with flies. The smell here is worse, sweet and sour, like something between decay and antiseptic whiskey. You see a soldier lying still, his face pale, his lips cracked. A nurse wipes his brow with water fetched from the same stream that's killing everyone. And then, in a moment that feels too real, he exhales once, softly. And that's it. Another name on the endless list. You realize that his death won't be counted as killed in action. He'll just be marked as died of disease. His sacrifice, invisible. Historians still argue about whether these unsung dead should be called casualties of war or victims of negligence. Some say it was inevitable. Medicine hadn't caught up yet. Others say it was avoidable, that ignorance, pride, and poor planning murdered more men than any musket. You can decide for yourself. As dusk falls again, the camp settles. The smell remains. A thin mist rises from the ground, mingling with the smoke of campfires. You imagine it curling upward like the spirits of the fallen, leaving behind the lesson they paid for in agony. That the smallest things, water, soap, and care, can decide who lives and who doesn't. You take one last breath of that fetid air and step back into silence. The bugs hum, the men cough, and somewhere, a soldier whispers a prayer that the next rain washes it all clean. But you know it won't. Not yet. You move away from the tents and follow the faint clang of metal striking wood. Ahead, beneath the shade of a hospital awning, you see surgeons at work. Uniforms streaked with blood, faces gray from exhaustion. The operating room is just a plank table laid across two barrels, its surface already darkened by use. You take a hesitant step closer, and that's when it hits you. The sharp, iron scent of blood, mixed with the sweet-sour odor of whiskey and sweat. You're about to witness medicine before modernity, a world of saws, not science. A soldier groans as orderlies lower him onto the table. His left leg dangles by a shred of flesh and fabric, mangled by a mini ball. The surgeon glances at it only briefly before nodding grimly. "Amputate," he says. There's no time for reflection. There are dozens more men waiting outside. Someone hands him a saw that's already seen too much action. You notice it isn't clean. Bits of bone dust cling to the teeth. An assistant steadies the soldier's shoulders. Another pours a small cup of whiskey into the man's mouth. No anesthesia yet, just liquid courage and a leather strap to bite down on. Ether exists, yes, but it's scarce, and many field hospitals can't afford to waste it. The surgeon begins to cut. The saw bites through flesh, through tendon, through bone. The sound is soft, rhythmic, horrifyingly mechanical. The man screams once, then faints. You glance away only to realize there are rows of severed limbs piled nearby, dozens of them, each one tagged with a name and regiment number before being tossed aside. The war's amputations would total over 60,000 by the end, enough arms and legs to fill a cemetery on their own. Historians still argue whether these amputations were brutal necessity or reckless overuse. But in context, the surgeons were often right. The mini ball, the small soft lead bullet fired from a rifled musket, didn't just pierce, it shattered. When it struck bone, it turned the limb to splinters. You couldn't set that kind of wound. The only way to save a life was to remove the limb before gangrene set in. Still, the speed was astonishing. The best Civil War surgeons could complete an amputation in under 10 minutes. They worked in teams, one to hold the patient, one to cut, one to tie arteries with silk thread, one to cauterize the stump with a red-hot iron. The smell of burning flesh mingled with whiskey and carbolic acid, a combination that would haunt the dreams of anyone who survived. You notice something strange in the rhythm of the operation. There's no panic here, no shouting, just a kind of grim efficiency. The surgeons speak in low voices, as if performing routine carpentry. And maybe, in their minds, that's what it was, a repair job, one of many. When they're done, they toss the saw into a bucket of bloody water, wipe their hands on their aprons, and call for the next patient. There's no sterilization, no fresh gloves, because there are no gloves at all. The same instruments cut through dozens of soldiers each day. Infection follows inevitably. Hospital gangrene, they called it. A necrotic, fast-spreading rot that could devour flesh overnight. Doctors described wounds turning black and emitting a smell so foul it made even seasoned nurses gag. One Confederate nurse wrote that she could always tell when gangrene had set in by the sound, a wet crackling when the wound was pressed. You shiver at that, and so would anyone. The cure, if it could be called that, was to cut away more flesh, or to pour nitric acid into the wound. You don't want to imagine the screams that followed. And yet, in this world of horror, there were glimpses of innovation. Some doctors began using chloroform as anesthesia, applying it with a rag over the nose. It wasn't perfect, but it spared many men from feeling the saw. Others experimented with antiseptic techniques inspired by early European science. washing instruments in whiskey or vinegar. It wasn't sterilization as we know it, but it helped. Here's a curious tidbit. Many surgeons had come straight from civilian life with little training. A few weeks earlier, they might have been dentists, barbers, or small-town doctors who'd never treated a gunshot wound. One soldier joked that you could tell a good surgeon by how few fingers he'd lost to infection. It's dark humor, but in war, jokes are medicine too. The Union Army eventually tried to organize chaos into order. Under Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, a new system emerged. Field dressing stations near the front, then mobile hospitals further back, and finally, general hospitals in major cities. It was the birth of the modern triage system. You patch up what you can on the field, stabilize the rest, and send the hopeless cases away to die in peace. The Confederates, perpetually short on everything, improvised heroically. They converted barns, churches, and even mansions into hospitals. At one plantation in Virginia, a single house treated over 500 men in 1 week. Imagine every room filled with cots, every stair rail hung with amputated limbs, every window open to let the smell escape. It's easy to assume these surgeons were butchers, but many were deeply compassionate. They wrote home about their guilt, their sleeplessness, their nightmares. A Union doctor once admitted, "I no longer dream of my wife, only of the saw." And amid the chaos came unlikely heroes, women who refused to stay home. Clara Barton, tending the wounded under fire at Antietam. Mary Ann Bickerdike, nicknamed Mother Bickerdike, who stormed into Union hospitals demanding better conditions, and once famously told an officer, "I'm in this army to stay, sir, and I'll take orders from General Grant and no one else." Sally Tompkins of the Confederacy personally funded and managed a hospital in Richmond that had the lowest mortality rate of any in the war. Historians still debate whether the Civil War truly marked the beginning of modern nursing, but there's no question that these women changed the way soldiers were cared for and how women were seen in public service. Before the war, most men scoffed at the idea of female nurses. By the end, many wouldn't trust anyone else. Outside the tent, a wagon arrives carrying fresh wounded from the latest skirmish. The orderlies unload them with practiced efficiency. One man's hand is gone at the wrist. Another stares blankly, lips moving in silent prayer. A boy, maybe 16, clutches his shoulder and asks softly if he'll get to go home soon. The doctor looks at the wound and doesn't answer. It's strange, isn't it, that progress can emerge from such horror. The Civil War forced America to confront death not as an individual tragedy, but as a logistical problem. Hospitals multiplied, records were standardized, and medical knowledge leapt forward by decades. The country learned to count its pain scientifically. You step back from the scene, your boots squelching in the muddy ground. The saw starts again behind you, steady and sure, and you realize this grim rhythm, the slice, the gasp, the silence, was the heartbeat of the war. The soldiers feared the hospitals more than the battlefield. A wound meant gambling your life on luck and the surgeon's stamina. Some men, shot through the limb, even begged to stay on the front lines rather than be taken to the rear. "Better to die on the field," one wrote, "than rot in the tent." As twilight settles, you look over the piles of discarded limbs. They look almost peaceful in the fading light, pale and still, as though they belong to no one now. You think about the young man from earlier, the one whose leg was taken to save his life. Maybe he'll survive, maybe not, but if he does, he'll carry that absence with him forever, like so many others, reminders of a war that redefined what survival even meant. You stand just outside the surgeon's tent now, the buzz of flies slowly drowning out the last cries from inside. A nurse passes by, her apron stiff with dried blood, eyes hollow with fatigue. Behind her, an orderly drags a small wooden crate, one filled not with rations or ammunition, but bullets. The crate is marked Minie balls, and its contents have changed the nature of death forever. You bend down, pick one up between your fingers. It's small, almost elegant, a hollow-based conical bullet, its surface dull gray with lead. You roll it in your palm, feeling its surprising weight. It looks harmless, but in truth, this is one of the deadliest innovations of the 19th century. Before the Civil War, muskets fired round balls that were wildly inaccurate beyond 50 yards. Battles were noisy chaos, thick volleys of smoke, men firing blindly. But the Minie ball, named after French officer Claude-Étienne Minier, changed that overnight. When fired from a rifled musket, its soft lead skirt expanded to grip the barrel's grooves, spinning the bullet as it flew. That spin gave it stability and devastating accuracy out to 500 yards. For the first time, ordinary soldiers could kill with sniper-like precision. And that meant that the open field formations inherited from Napoleon's wars were suddenly suicidal. Historians still argue whether the generals of 1861 truly understood what the Minie ball had done to their art of war. Some say they clung to honor and parade ground drill, unwilling to accept that massed charges were now suicide. Others argue they simply lacked the imagination to adapt. Either way, the result was predictable. Long lines of men marching into withering fire that tore through flesh, bone, and muscle as if they were paper. You flip the bullet in your hand, staring at its blunt nose. When this little thing hit bone, it didn't just break it, it exploded it. Soldiers described limbs shattered to splinters, wounds that looked as if they'd been struck by cannon fire. If the bullet hit an arm or leg, amputation was nearly guaranteed. If it hit the torso, it was fatal. A surgeon once remarked that a Minie ball wound took away what God had joined together. That wasn't poetry, it was anatomy. The bullet's low velocity meant it flattened and deformed inside the body, tearing jagged paths impossible to repair. You could survive being grazed. You could even survive a clean entry and exit through soft tissue. But if it touched bone, you were as good as gone. You glanced toward a pile of rifles stacked neatly by the camp fence. The Springfield Model 1861, standard issue for the Union, could fire these bullets with deadly accuracy. The Confederacy used captured Springfields, Enfields, and a mishmash of older models. The weapons themselves were marvels of craftsmanship, but in the hands of frightened farm boys, they became tools of mass amputation. There's a strange irony here. This bullet, small and cheap, was meant to make war more efficient. It did. It just didn't make it cleaner. You imagine standing in line during one of those massive engagements, maybe at Antietam or Gettysburg. Your sergeant shouts, the world erupts in smoke and noise, and suddenly, men around you start dropping. One's jaw disappears in a flash of red mist. Another spins backward, screaming that his leg feels gone. Within minutes, your regiment, 500 strong, is half that size, and yet you keep reloading, because that's what the manual says to do. The Minie ball made every soldier into both executioner and victim. It forced the war into a new reality, one where courage mattered less than trajectory, and where skill at aiming could turn a farmer into an industrial-scale killer. Curiously, the bullet's design wasn't the only reason it was deadly. The soft lead left behind fragments inside wounds that poisoned the blood. Soldiers who survived the initial shot often died days later from infection or lead poisoning. You'd think doctors would remove the fragments, but without x-rays or proper lighting, finding them was guesswork. Some surgeons probed blindly with their fingers, feeling for metal in the dark. Others poured mercury into wounds to locate bullets, not realizing they were adding another layer of poison. A Union private at Spotsylvania described watching a man's arm turn the color of bruised fruit after being hit by a Minie ball. The next day they amputated. The day after that, he died anyway. The bullet went out, the diarist wrote, but the death stayed in. There's a morbid fascination to these bullets. Even today, relic hunters dig them up by the thousands across old battlefields. Some still have teeth marks from soldiers who clenched them during surgery. Others are fused together, kissing bullets they're called, fired from opposite sides and colliding mid-air. It sounds romantic, until you remember that behind every one of those, someone died. And yet, not every encounter with the Minie ball ended in despair. Some men survived impossible hits. One Confederate soldier took a bullet through both cheeks, lost 6 teeth, and lived to eat grits the next morning. Another was shot through the chest but survived because the bullet passed cleanly between his ribs without striking bone. Doctors, amazed, began studying such cases, collecting data that would later shape trauma surgery. In that way, even destruction became a lesson. Historians still debate whether the Minie ball alone explains the war's high lethality, or whether it was the mindset of the men who fired it. You can't really separate them. Technology made killing easy. Pride made it inevitable. Generals like Pickett, Burnside, and Hood kept ordering frontal assaults, convinced that bravery could overcome ballistics. The bullets proved them wrong, every single time. You imagine being there at Gettysburg during Pickett's charge, when 12,500 Confederate soldiers advanced across open ground toward Union lines armed with these weapons. The defenders, using Minie ball rifles, fired volley after volley. Within 20 minutes, half of Pickett's men were down. The survivors described the air as alive with bees, the ground vibrating beneath their boots. It wasn't honor that decided the outcome. It was geometry and physics. The Minie ball didn't just kill. It transformed the psychology of warfare. Men learned to fear open ground, to dig, to hide. What began as wooden breastworks and shallow ditches would, by war's end, evolve into the sprawling trench networks of Petersburg, a grim foreshadowing of the Western Front 50 years later. You rub the bullet again between your fingers, noticing a faint groove worn into its side. Maybe it struck bone, maybe earth, maybe both. Either way, it did its job perfectly. Here's a curious footnote. The very qualities that made the Minie ball lethal, its spin, its accuracy, its stability, also made it beautiful to early weapons enthusiasts. Some even collected them as souvenirs. After the war, northern factories sold leftover ammunition as patriotic mementos. It's unsettling to think of death repackaged as nostalgia, but perhaps that's how people made sense of it all, turning horror into history. You place the bullet back into the crate and step away, wiping your hands on your trousers as if to remove its ghostly residue. Behind you, somewhere in the distance, you hear the pop of musket fire. A reminder that thousands of others are flying through the air even now. Each one carries a name it doesn't yet know. The war's brutality wasn't only in numbers, it was in the intimacy of it. Every bullet fired from one American hit another. Every shattered bone belonged to someone's brother, someone's son. The Minie ball made the Civil War not just a conflict of armies, but a slow, mechanical fratricide. You think about that as you walk back toward camp. The dusk is quiet. A soldier nearby cleans his rifle, humming softly, unaware that the next time he fires it, it might be the last thing he ever does. In your hand, you still feel the weight of that small lead bullet. It's astonishing, really, how something so tiny could change the world, could turn courage into tragedy and technology into terror. And it reminds you, uncomfortably, that progress is rarely kind. You stand on the ridge at dawn, musket smoke still curling over the trees like morning fog. The battlefield below is littered with men and shattered cannon wheels, and in the still air, the faint crackle of fire mixes with groans that refuse to fade. This is where technology finally caught up with courage, where the age of honor met the age of industry. The Civil War is often remembered as a clash of ideals. But on mornings like this, you realize it was also a test of engineering. Rifles, artillery, logistics, every piece of machinery became part of the killing equation. The Minie ball might have turned the individual rifle into a precision tool of death, but the artillery turned entire landscapes into killing fields. You walk toward a battery of guns, bronze barrels glinting in the sun, their muzzles blackened by powder. The soldiers tending them move like clockwork, swabbing, loading, aiming. This is the rhythm of industrial slaughter, measured, practiced, inevitable. Each cannon can hurl a shell more than a mile, and these aren't just simple iron balls anymore. By the 1860s, artillery had evolved. Rifled cannon like the Parrott gun and Whitworth rifle could strike targets with deadly precision at unheard-of distances. Historians still argue which innovation was more decisive, the rifled musket or the rifled cannon. The musket made every soldier dangerous. The cannon made entire hills lethal. The Parrott rifle, for instance, could fire a 20-pound shell that exploded on impact, sending shards of iron spinning through the air. The noise alone could kill your hearing. The shockwave could rattle your ribs. One Confederate artillerist described watching Union shells burst among the men like thunder, splitting wood. The ground shook. Horses reared. Trees disintegrated into splinters that became deadly projectiles of their own. The Civil War turned nature itself into shrapnel. You run your fingers along a spent Parrott shell lying half buried in the mud. It feels heavy, dense, with purpose. When these shells hit infantry formations, the results were horrifying. Entire lines erased in seconds. At Gettysburg, one Union soldier recalled seeing a company of men disappear as if the earth had swallowed them. You can almost feel the heat of it still, that instantaneous rewriting of existence. Yet even this technological leap came with quirks. The Parrott gun, though powerful, was prone to cracking its own barrel after repeated use. Some crews refused to fire it more than a dozen times per battle. The Confederate Whitworth, imported from Britain, was so accurate it was often used for long-range sniping, reportedly capable of hitting a target over a mile away, but its hexagonal ammunition was expensive and scarce. Both sides found themselves juggling brilliance and disaster in the same breath. There's something darkly comic in it all. Men with 19th century manners using 20th century weapons. They saluted before firing, shouted hurrah, as if this were still Waterloo, not realizing they were standing inside a prototype for Verdun. The artillery made certain battles look like scenes from another planet. At Shiloh, explosions rained through the forest, igniting the underbrush. Trees burned down to stumps while shells screamed overhead. Witnesses described the ground trembling like a living thing. One soldier wrote, "It was as if hell had opened its gates and the devil himself was the gunner." But it wasn't just the noise, it was the precision. Before this war, cannon fire was largely guesswork. Now, rifled barrels and improved sighting made it mathematical. You could zero in on an enemy position with frightening accuracy. By the war's midpoint, some batteries could bracket a target within a few shots, adjusting for wind and elevation. Killing had become a science. Still, there were misfires. Artillery shells sometimes exploded inside the gun, taking out their own crews. Powder was unpredictable. A single spark could ignite an entire caisson. You imagine standing beside a stack of ammunition taller than you, knowing one errant ember could vaporize everything in a flash of white light. A strange side effect of all this innovation was how it changed the landscape. Battlefields that had once been open plains became moonscapes of craters, splintered trees, and broken fences. The war literally tore the skin off the earth. In the aftermath of each major fight, reporters noted that not a leaf remained untouched. In some areas, the air stayed thick with powder smoke for days, coating everything in a gray film. The world turned monochrome. The psychological impact was immense. Soldiers who'd once marched boldly into battle began dreading the very sound of distant artillery. They learned to recognize the pitch of different shells. Some whistled, some buzzed, some gave no warning at all. Veterans could tell, from sound alone, whether a shot would fall short or land on top of them. Imagine living with that instinct, that involuntary flinch that never goes away. And yet, amid all this mechanized carnage, there were moments of awe. Some soldiers described the sight of night bombardments as terrible beauty. Streaks of fire arcing through darkness, explosions painting the sky. One Union officer compared it to fireworks for the damned. You can almost picture it, the earth shaking beneath you, the horizon glowing orange, and still, some part of your mind whispering that it's beautiful. A lesser-known weapon also deserves its place in this grim symphony: the canister shot. Imagine a cannon loaded not with a shell, but with hundreds of small iron balls. When fired, it turned the gun into a giant shotgun. At close range, it could obliterate an entire company. At Antietam, one Confederate battery reportedly fired so much canister that the barrels glowed red. Soldiers said the air was filled with a metal hail, and those who survived swore they could taste iron in the air for days. Historians still debate how much artillery, compared to small arms, accounted for total casualties. Some argue artillery caused about 10 to 15% of the deaths. Others insist it was far higher. But regardless of numbers, it was artillery that changed how men felt about battle. It made courage obsolete. You couldn't fight bravery against physics, a curious detail. At Petersburg, the siege that dragged on for nearly 10 months, both sides developed elaborate systems to counter artillery. They built tunnels, earthworks, bomb-proof shelters. Soldiers slept underground like moles, safe from the iron rain above. The lines barely moved, but the shells never stopped. It was the grim rehearsal for the trench warfare that would define the next century. You crouch by one of those battered cannons. Its barrel cool now, the fight over. A soldier nearby wipes his brow, deafened and dazed. "She's a good girl," he mutters, patting the gun's side. You realize he's talking to it like it's alive. Maybe, to him, it is. When a machine saves your life and takes so many others, you start to believe it has a soul. There's a philosophical weight to this. The moment humanity realized that invention and destruction had finally merged. Every improvement in accuracy meant another mother's grief delivered more efficiently. Progress wasn't a straight line anymore. It was a spiral of fire and iron. You step back from the battery and look at the smoking horizon. The Civil War was fought with new weapons but old minds. And as those minds slowly began to grasp what they'd unleashed, something fundamental shifted in the human story. The romance of battle died here, buried under shell fragments and mathematical precision. A century later, when generals on other continents dug trenches and aimed howitzers, they'd be echoing what was born in these American fields. Every rumble of modern warfare carries a ghost from Gettysburg or Shiloh. You take one last look at the cannon before walking away. Its muzzle points at the sky now, as if ashamed. The birds haven't returned yet. The air still hums faintly, as though the earth itself remembers the vibration of impact. And you realize you're standing at the threshold between the old world and the new, between the saber and the shell, between courage and calculation. The Civil War didn't just decide a nation's fate. It decided how all future wars would be fought and how many lives they would take. The smoke clears, but the silence that follows is worse. You stand in an open field scarred by craters and blackened grass. The air feels heavy, thick with the ghost of gunpowder. Around you, soldiers move like sleepwalkers, their uniforms torn, their eyes glazed. You watch as officers shout, reorganizing lines for another attack, and you can't help but wonder if they truly see what's happening around them. Because this, right here, is the tragedy of the American Civil War. The mismatch between old tactics and new weapons. Generals on both sides had studied the same manuals, the Napoleonic playbook, polished and proud. Born in an era when honor was measured by how straight your line marched. They believed in shock, in momentum, in courage as the deciding factor. But courage, when it meets rifled muskets and Minie balls, becomes just another word for suicide. You can see it unfold before your eyes. The bugle sounds. Regimental flags rise. Hundreds of men form into perfect rows, shoulder to shoulder, bright colors snapping in the wind. It looks beautiful, almost ceremonial, until the first volley erupts from the other side. The neat lines crumble in seconds. Men drop like wheat before a scythe. Whole companies erased before they cross halfway. Historians still argue whether this stubbornness came from pride or ignorance. Some say the generals couldn't comprehend how lethal modern firearms had become. Others think they knew, but had no better plan. The infrastructure for flexible, small unit tactics simply didn't exist yet, so they did what their teachers at West Point had drilled into them: march, fire, charge, repeat. Take the Battle of Fredericksburg, December 1862. The Union Army launched 14 separate frontal assaults against Confederate lines dug in behind a stone wall. 14. Each one ended the same way: waves of blue uniforms cut down by withering rifle and artillery fire. The Confederates barely had to move. When night fell, the snow turned red. Over 12,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded in a single day. And yet, the generals kept ordering more attacks, convinced that sheer determination could shatter physics. There's a cruel elegance in that kind of blindness. The same men who prided themselves on rational strategy failed to see that they were fighting the wrong century. One officer later admitted, "We might as well have charged a storm." You kneel beside a fallen soldier, his musket still clutched in his hands. The ramrod is halfway down the barrel. He never finished reloading. His coat is torn where the bullet entered, a small hole that hides a catastrophic wound. The Minie ball doesn't leave clean exits. It unthreads the body from the inside. Nearby, another man, barely more than a boy, sits upright, staring into space. His regiment was ordered to advance across this same open field 3 times. His voice is flat when he mutters, "They said courage wins battles." You can't tell if he's praying or laughing. Here's the haunting irony. Both sides thought they were learning. After each massacre, they told themselves, "Next time, we'll get it right." But the lessons came slowly. At Cold Harbor, Union soldiers wrote their names and home addresses on slips of paper and pinned them to their coats before attacking. They knew they were marching to die. One survivor said, "It was murder, not war." By the middle of the war, some officers began to adapt. They started using skirmish lines, looser formations designed to take advantage of cover. Others experimented with night assaults or feigned retreats. But these innovations came too late for the thousands already buried. It's easy now to criticize them, to sit comfortably in hindsight and call them fools. But imagine being in their boots, trained in old world doctrine, burdened by political pressure, trapped in a system that rewarded aggression over caution. The world had changed faster than they could keep up. Historians still debate which battle truly marked the turning point in tactical evolution. Some say it was Antietam, when both armies realized frontal assaults only filled graves. Others point to Spotsylvania or Petersburg, where trench lines became the new normal. Either way, the Civil War became a cruel teacher, forcing men to evolve under fire. The shift from open field battles to fortified positions wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Soldiers who once marched boldly into musket fire now clung to dirt for survival. Trenches sprouted along ridges and riverbanks, crude at first, then increasingly elaborate. Men dug through frozen ground with bayonets, tin cups, even bare hands. Earth became the only armor they could trust. There's a grim humor to it. The war began with parades and ended in mud. By 1864, both sides were living like moles, huddled in trenches that stretched for miles. The same tactics that once defined heroism, charging, waving the flag, shouting hurrah, had become obsolete. Now, heroism meant keeping your head down and surviving another day. But before that grim adaptation took hold, countless lives were wasted testing the limits of courage. Think of Pickett's charge. We'll get there soon. Or the repeated assaults at Franklin and Chickamauga. Each time the same mistake: straight lines, open ground and men marching into invisible walls of lead. It's strange to realize how slowly people learn when pride is on the line. The Civil War wasn't short of intelligence, it was short of humility. Generals believed they could bend the laws of ballistics to their will, that moral strength could deflect bullets. You might almost admire that faith if it hadn't cost so many lives. One little-known anecdote says that after witnessing yet another failed charge, a Confederate colonel threw his sword into the dirt and muttered, "We are fighting ghosts with muskets." Maybe he meant the ghosts of Napoleon's army, the phantom doctrines that refused to die even as real men did. The mismatch wasn't only on the battlefield. It existed in every mind that still romanticized war. Painters back home imagined gallant charges and noble deaths. Politicians boasted of glory, but soldiers who survived knew better. They wrote letters that stripped the glamour away. "The smell of blood and powder is not glory," one wrote. "It is what hell would smell like if it had rained." The war forced a reckoning. Every generation before this one had dreamed of battle as a stage for bravery. The Civil War smashed that illusion. It proved that courage couldn't stop a bullet, that bravery and futility could exist in the same breath. You take a deep breath. The air feels thick, metallic. The field stretches endlessly before you, and you can almost see the ghosts of those long-dead regiments still standing in formation, muskets leveled, waiting for a command that never should have been given. And maybe that's the final tragedy, that they obeyed anyway. Because obedience was the only thing left that made sense when everything else had gone mad. You walk through the field one last time, your boots sinking into the soil that drank so much blood it probably remembers the taste. And in that silence, you realize something unsettling. Wars don't just evolve through technology. They evolve through failure, through men dying in patterns until someone finally asks, "Is there another way?" You feel the weight of all those futile charges lingering in the air as you step into the humid July heat of Pennsylvania, 1863. The sun glares down on a rolling expanse of farmland, dotted with fence lines and hay bales. You hear distant cannon fire, steady, rhythmic, like a giant heartbeat echoing across the hills. This is Gettysburg, and you've arrived just before one of the most infamous moments in American history, Pickett's charge. The scene seems deceptively peaceful. Birds flutter overhead, the wheat sways in the wind. But every man here knows what's coming. Confederate soldiers stand in formation, lined up shoulder to shoulder in perfect symmetry. 13 brigades, nearly 12,500 men, stretch across a mile of open ground. Flags ripple, drummers beat out a steady march. And at the far end of this field, just under a mile away, the Union Army waits, dug in behind stone walls and cannon batteries. You can almost feel the tension in the air tighten like a drawn bowstring. Historians still argue over who truly ordered the charge. Was it General Robert E. Lee's stubborn pride or General James Longstreet's reluctant obedience? Some say it was desperation, the Confederacy's last chance to break the Union line and win the battle. Others believe Lee simply trusted too much in the valor of his men. Either way, you're standing at the edge of a tragedy about to unfold in slow motion. When the signal cannon booms, the line begins to move. Thousands of gray-clad soldiers step forward, bayonets glinting. From afar, it looks majestic, even beautiful. An ocean of men advancing with precision and purpose. You can almost understand why observers described it as sublime. But the illusion lasts only a few seconds. The first Union artillery volley lands. The explosion tears a gap through the line. Men vanish, replaced by a spray of dirt and limbs. The survivors close ranks, stepping over bodies, and keep marching. Another shell hits, another gap. Still, they come. The Confederate artillery had tried to soften the Union defenses earlier, but their aim was off. The Union positions remain almost untouched. You watch from behind a low rise as the Confederate advance continues across the field. The ground trembles beneath your boots. Smoke thickens. Gunfire quickens, and the once proud formation begins to dissolve. Shell fragments scream through the air like banshees. Men fall in clusters, not single file. Whole families of neighbors from Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee cut down together. One survivor later wrote that the sound of the Union guns rolled over us like a mountain collapsing. Another remembered seeing the man beside him vanish in a red mist, his hat still floating in the air. It's not just chaos, it's annihilation. Still, the survivors press on. The front ranks reach a small fence midway across the field and start climbing. Union sharpshooters pick them off one by one. The fence becomes a bottleneck, a cruel choke point where bravery turns to futility. You see officers waving their swords, shouting, "Forward! Forward!" Their words vanish in the roar of musketry. By the time the Confederates reach the base of the Union Ridge, less than half remain. The survivors fix bayonets and run up the slope toward a stone wall, the infamous angle. For a brief moment, it looks like they might break through. General Lewis Armistead leads his men over the wall, shouting, "Give them the cold steel." He waves his hat on his sword tip as a rallying cry, just before he's shot down. That point, the high water mark of the Confederacy, will become one of the most studied spots in American military history. Historians still debate whether the South could have won the war had they broken through that day. But standing here, watching the smoke rise, you realize it doesn't matter. The cost is already beyond comprehension. Within 20 minutes, Pickett's charge collapses. The survivors stumble back across the same mile of open ground, pursued by relentless fire. The dead and dying are so thick that the field seems to breathe. Pickett's entire division, nearly 6,000 men, is gone. When Lee rides out to meet him, Pickett's eyes are hollow. "General," he whispers, "I have no division left." You picture that. The silence after the slaughter, the smell of blood and dust mixing with summer heat. Even the Union soldiers, victorious, feel no joy. One officer later said, "We could not cheer. It was too awful." The irony is cruel. This moment, often romanticized in Southern lore, was not a noble charge. It was the death rattle of an old world refusing to die. Lee's faith in valor had collided with modern firepower, and the result was predictable. The lesson was written in blood. Courage cannot outrun artillery. You crouch near the stone wall where so many fell. The grass still bears faint hollows where bodies once lay. A tattered kepi lies half buried in the soil, initials stitched inside. JWC. Whoever he was, he never made it back to Virginia. You brush off the dirt, and for a moment, the past feels painfully near. Historians still debate whether Lee's decision was madness or misplaced genius. Some argue he gambled everything on one bold stroke because he believed the Union Army was weaker than it looked. Others say his moral compass, his belief in divine providence, blinded him. Longstreet, his second in command, reportedly begged him not to order the charge, saying, "It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." Lee answered simply, "The enemy is there, and I am going to strike him." That, perhaps, is the essence of 19th century warfare. Faith in the strike, faith in the spectacle, faith in courage as a physical force. And yet the Civil War was busy proving that faith wrong, one corpse at a time. When you think about Pickett's charge, you realize it wasn't just a tactical blunder. It was a cultural extinction. It marked the end of chivalric warfare, the moment when romance and reality parted ways. After Gettysburg, both sides began to abandon massed assaults. They dug trenches, built barricades, fortified ridges. The future had arrived, uninvited. There's an eerie stillness in the aftermath. The field, once echoing with cannon fire, now hums with flies. Wounded men call out for water, their voices hoarse, fading. The sun sinks lower, and the shadows of fences stretch long across the dead. A Union soldier walking the field that evening wrote, "You could cross 100 yards without touching ground, just bodies." Imagine that. And yet, even here, compassion flickers. Medics from both sides venture out under truce to collect the wounded. One Confederate officer is found clutching a Union Bible. One Union private is discovered holding a Confederate handkerchief pressed to his wound. The story of Pickett's charge has been told so often that it risks becoming legend. But the truth, seen up close, isn't heroic. It's heartbreaking. The Confederacy lost more than men that day. It lost the illusion that courage could defeat technology, that devotion could outweigh physics. And yet, somehow, Lee still rode among his men afterward, apologizing for their loss, taking the blame. "It is all my fault," he said quietly. Some wept. Others couldn't look him in the eye. It's hard to imagine a moment that better captures the paradox of the Civil War. Nobility tangled with tragedy, honor tangled with hubris. As dusk deepens, you walk the field once more. The earth crunches softly under your boots, the faint scent of sulfur still clinging to the air. The horizon glows a pale orange as the last artillery fires fade. You realize you're walking not just through a battlefield, but through a turning point in human history. Here, on this quiet Pennsylvania ridge, the old world died. And though the men who fought here didn't know it, they'd already written the opening chapter of modern warfare, where courage no longer guarantees survival, and where death comes not in single combat, but in waves. You whisper into the cooling wind. It wasn't supposed to be this way, but history rarely listens. You linger on that ridge at Gettysburg until the night folds over the land. But the story doesn't end here. The smoke may have lifted, yet the lesson of that doomed charge spread across every front of the war. By the following year, both Union and Confederate commanders had learned that open field assaults were just invitations for mass graves. And so the soldiers began to dig. At first, it's simple. Shallow ditches, a few logs piled high to catch stray bullets. But as months turn into years, the defenses evolve into elaborate earthworks, walls, trenches, zigzagging lines of fortifications that scar the countryside. The armies that once gloried in bold maneuvers now spend their days behind mounds of dirt. The Civil War, in its final stage, becomes a grim preview of the 20th century. Trench warfare in all but name. You find yourself outside Petersburg, Virginia, in the summer of 1864. The air is damp and suffocating, and the line of trenches stretches farther than you can see. Men live down there, eat, sleep, and fight in holes barely wide enough for two to pass. Rats scurry over boots. The mud stinks of unwashed bodies and gunpowder. You can't help but think of them as moles in uniforms. When shells land, the dirt trembles like a living thing. The soldiers have even given nicknames to the worst shells: the Whistling Dick, the Screamer, the Petersburg Express. You hear one now, its shriek splitting the night before it explodes somewhere down the line. Men barely flinch anymore. One of them smirks and mutters, "Close, but not close enough." Historians still argue whether this static warfare represented ingenuity or exhaustion. Some say it was evidence of tactical evolution, the moment armies realized defense finally had the upper hand. Others see it as despair made visible, a stalemate carved into the earth itself. Whatever you call it, this is where the Civil War loses its illusions completely. A few yards away, you spot a crude wooden sign jammed into the parapet. It reads, "Home Sweet Hole." Someone's humor hasn't died yet. In fact, gallows humor is everywhere. Jokes about lice, about missing limbs, about the terrible coffee. Soldiers hang up playing cards to mark sniper shots, an ace for a hit, a joker for a miss. Between bombardments, they write letters, carve chess pieces from bullets, or stare into nothing. You overhear one Union private reading aloud from a newspaper that finally reached the front. "They call this the Siege of Petersburg," he says, "but I call it the slow burial of both armies." You can't tell if anyone laughs. If you could step back and look at the trenches from above, you'd see a grim geometry. A honeycomb of death stretching across fields, connected by tunnels and communication trenches. Some positions are so close that men can hear each other breathe at night. They shout insults, toss tobacco, sometimes even trade newspapers across the no man's land. For all their hatred, they're bound together by the same mud, the same mosquitoes, the same waiting. One of the strangest episodes comes on July 30th, 1864, when Union engineers decide to end the stalemate with science. They dig a tunnel under the Confederate lines, fill it with 8,000 pounds of gunpowder, and detonate it at dawn. The explosion is monstrous. Earth and men blasted 100 feet into the air. Witnesses say the sky rained body parts for nearly a minute. The blast kills hundreds instantly and leaves a crater 170 feet long and 30 feet deep. But the victory lasts only minutes. Union troops, instead of skirting the crater, rush into it, trapped, disoriented, and crushed under Confederate fire from above. When it's over, the crater has become a tomb. Historians still debate whether it was genius sabotaged by poor execution or just another example of how innovation and chaos rarely mix. You walk near the crater's edge and peer down into the earth. The dirt has long since filled in, but the shape remains. It looks less like a wound now and more like a scar, a reminder that even brilliance can backfire when desperation takes the lead. Life in these trenches grinds down every trace of romanticism. Uniforms rot off bodies. Boots dissolve into rags. Soldiers sleep beside corpses too dangerous to move during daylight. The constant rain turns the ditches into swamps, where water stands ankle deep and smells of sulfur and decay. Men get trench foot before the term even exists. Skin peeling, toes blackening, infections creeping upward. And yet, despite it all, the war drags on. Every night, the glow of distant fires flickers against the horizon, and you realize this has become a war of endurance, not glory. Some historians call Petersburg the graveyard of the old way of war. They're right. You can see it in the soldiers' faces. Young men aged into ghosts before their time. No more parades, no more bands. Just the steady percussion of shells and the scrape of shovels. Curiously, these conditions birth something new. Discipline, born from survival. Commanders on both sides start emphasizing entrenchment, camouflage, coordinated fire. The word cover becomes sacred. Soldiers learn to listen for the pause between shell bursts, using it to run messages or fetch water. Every instinct that once made a soldier brave, standing tall, shouting loudly, leading from the front, is now suicidal. The smartest ones are the ones who hug the dirt. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the future echoing here. The sounds, the hiss of shells, the cough of rifles, the muttered jokes between explosions, are the same sounds you'd hear half a century later in France or Flanders. This is where modern war was rehearsed, with shovels and black powder instead of tanks and gas. A quirky footnote: some soldiers, trapped in the monotony of siege life, began cultivating small gardens along the trench walls. Onions, turnips, even flowers sprouted amid the carnage. One Confederate officer wrote proudly to his wife that he'd grown a fine patch of beans to remind me of home. Another carved rose garden into a plank above his dugout, though nothing ever grew there. It was their way of reclaiming a sliver of humanity in a place determined to erase it. And sometimes, in the rare quiet between shellings, both sides would agree to an unspoken truce. They'd climb onto the parapets, stretch their legs, and watch the sunset. One Union soldier wrote that, for a few minutes each evening, the world felt normal again. Just men looking at the same sky. You sit beside him in imagination, feeling the evening breeze carry the faint smell of smoke and rain. The sky glows pink over Petersburg, soft and deceptive. Somewhere, a single cannon fires, echoing like a heartbeat against the horizon. You can almost believe it's over, but you know it isn't. The trenches will hold for nearly 10 months. 10 months of digging, bleeding, waiting. 10 months of disease, hunger, and despair. And when Petersburg finally falls, it won't be because one side was smarter, but because one side simply ran out of strength. As the last light fades, you realize that this war has come full circle. From naive charges on open fields to men burrowed in the ground like frightened animals. The age of glory has been buried here, beneath the Virginia soil. You whisper to yourself, the future started in this dirt. And somewhere, in the wind that sweeps across the silent trenches, you swear you hear the faint, metallic echo of all the wars yet to come. You wake to the sound of distant shouting, a commander's voice rising above the low rumble of cannon. It's dawn again at Petersburg, though the days blur together now. The smell of powder and wet clay is the same. The cries from the hospitals, the same. And so are the mistakes. You begin to notice a pattern that seems almost cruel in its predictability. Each new general believes he will do better than the last, because behind every assault, every order, every wasted life stands the same force that's as deadly as disease or artillery: leadership, and all the fragile egos that come with it. The Civil War was a showcase of brilliance and blunder, living side by side. You can trace the conflict's rhythm not just through battles, but through the personalities that shaped them. Men like Robert E. Lee, whose poise could turn defeat into poetry. Ulysses S. Grant, stoic and relentless, who believed in grinding the enemy down no matter the cost. And then there were the rest, the cautious, the reckless, the prideful, the indecisive. You think back to the early war years, when the Union Army was led by General George B. McClellan. He was brilliant on paper, charismatic, adored by his men, a master of organization. But his flaw was fatal. He hesitated. At Antietam, he faced an enemy outnumbered and bleeding, yet refused to deliver the final blow. If he can't fight, he can't command, Lincoln muttered in frustration. McClellan later ran against him for president and lost, still believing he could have won the war if only he'd been given more time. Historians still argue whether McClellan's caution saved lives or wasted them. Then there was Ambrose Burnside, remembered less for strategy and more for his magnificent sideburns. His tenure as commander of the Army of the Potomac ended in disaster at Fredericksburg when he ordered those suicidal assaults on Marye's Heights. Soldiers trudged up that slope again and again, knowing they were walking into death. Burnside later wrote that he could still hear their screams in his dreams. You pause at that thought. Maybe all generals hear the echoes of their mistakes. Some just learn to live with them. Grant, on the other hand, learned differently. He wasn't flashy and he wasn't sentimental. He believed wars were won through attrition, through persistence, not perfection. At Shiloh, his army was caught off guard and nearly destroyed, but he refused to retreat. At Vicksburg, he laid siege until the city starved into surrender. When asked about his philosophy, he replied simply, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." It did, and then some. Grant's genius was patience. His flaw was indifference to numbers. His overland campaign in 1864 killed tens of thousands of his own men, but it bled Lee's army white. Some critics called him a butcher. Others saw him as a realist who understood that compassion on the battlefield was cruelty in the long run. Historians still debate whether Grant's brand of war was moral or monstrous. Lee, meanwhile, was fighting a different kind of war, one built on charisma, speed, and risk. His men adored him. He rode among them with quiet dignity, never raising his voice, his presence alone enough to steady fear. His victories at Chancellorsville and Second Manassas were strokes of genius, audacity outpacing logic. But genius and hubris often walk hand in hand. Gettysburg proved it. When Lee ordered Pickett's charge, his faith in courage blinded him to reality. "It is well that war is so terrible," he once said, "or we should grow too fond of it." You can't help wondering if he ever stopped being fond of it. Leadership, you realize, is a strange alchemy. The same traits that inspire loyalty can also cause disaster. Stonewall Jackson, Lee's right hand, was a religious zealot whose precision made him one of the South's most feared commanders. But his fervor also made him unpredictable. At Chancellorsville, his own men shot him by mistake during a night patrol. When he died, Lee wept, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." The Confederacy lost something deeper, a sense that divine favor was on its side. On the Union side, you picture William Tecumseh Sherman, Grant's restless counterpart. Sherman understood that victory wasn't just about battles. It was about breaking a society's will to fight. His march to the sea in 1864 carved a fiery path through Georgia, torching railroads, factories, and farms. Civilians wept as they watched their livelihoods burn, yet Sherman justified it. War is cruelty. You cannot refine it. It's hard to argue with the man who finished the job. Harder still to forgive him. Historians still argue whether Sherman's campaign was necessary or excessive, liberation or terror. But in hindsight, he was simply practicing what every modern general would one day preach: total war, where the line between soldier and citizen blurs to ash. Not every leader was remembered kindly. Some vanished into obscurity, their failures quietly buried with their men. Others became legends, not for what they won, but for what they lost. Confederate General John Bell Hood, once a daring division commander, led his army into near annihilation at Franklin and Nashville. When asked why, he blamed divine misfortune. But soldiers who survived said it wasn't God, it was pride. You realize that's the true constant running through all of these stories. Pride. The North's pride and unity. The South's pride and honor. The generals' pride in their reputations. Pride filled the gaps left by strategy. It drove men to make choices that defied logic, to stand where they should have retreated, to fight one more day when reason said enough. And yet, leadership wasn't always about grand decisions. Sometimes it was about small mercies. A commander pausing to share rations. A captain writing letters for dying soldiers. One officer, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, turned a desperate defense at Little Round Top into legend by ordering a bayonet charge after his men ran out of ammunition. That impossible act saved the Union flank and perhaps the entire battle. Later, when offered a promotion, he refused to take credit. We were just men who did not wish to die with our backs turned. Moments like that remind you that leadership can still mean humanity. For every arrogant fool who threw lives away, there were quiet heroes who held the line out of love rather than ambition. You look around and imagine all those leaders, famous and forgotten, sharing the same battlefield of memory. Their faces blur together, some calm, some haunted. They didn't all win, but they all carried the unbearable burden of deciding who would live and who would not. A curious footnote lingers. After the war, many of these men became teachers, politicians, and writers. McClellan lectured on military history. Sherman wrote his memoirs with wry detachment. Grant, dying of cancer years later, spent his final months writing his autobiography, desperate to provide for his family. He finished it days before his death. When it was published, readers wept not just for the general, but for the weary man who finally admitted that no one really wins a war. As you stand among their ghosts, you can't help feeling a strange sympathy for all of them. The arrogant, the cautious, the ruthless, the kind. They were all caught in the same trap, trying to control chaos with conviction. And maybe that's what leadership really is. Not glory, not genius, just the stubborn will to act when everyone else hesitates. You turn away from the distant guns. Somewhere, a new order is being shouted, another decision that will cost hundreds of lives. And you realize that while weapons evolve, human nature rarely does. The battlefield may change, but pride and ambition still hold the pen that writes history in blood. The echoes of those commanding voices fade as you move away from the front lines. Now, instead of the clatter of musket fire, you hear a different kind of machinery humming. A rhythm of industry, of forges and furnaces and railways stretching like veins across a continent. Because while generals argued over tactics and soldiers died in the mud, another army of mechanics, miners, and railroad men was deciding the war in silence. This was not just a clash of ideas, it was a clash of economies, a collision between the 19th century's last agrarian dream and its first industrial reality. You find yourself in the Union heartland, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, where ironworks and textile mills blaze through the night, their chimneys painting the sky red. The air smells of coal and ambition. Inside the factories, men and women hammer iron into rifles, press bullets, sew uniforms. Steam engines shriek like living things. Every week, thousands of tons of material roll out. Rails, boots, blankets, cannon shells, all heading south on the arteries of progress, the railroads. The Civil War was the first truly modern logistical war. Never before had so many moving parts, factories, trains, telegraphs, supply depots, been coordinated to feed an army hundreds of miles away. The Union's advantage wasn't just manpower, it was momentum. Historians still argue whether the North's victory was won more by strategy or supply. The answer, if you look closely, lies in these rails. The Union laid down over 20,000 miles of track before the war even began. The Confederacy barely had a third of that, and its lines were patchy, unconnected, and built on incompatible gauges. When the fighting started, the North could move an entire corps of men across states in days. The South struggled to move food between its own cities. You can almost see it. The endless procession of locomotives, belching smoke, hauling artillery and grain. Men waving from flat cars as they rumble toward battle. The whistle of the train became the sound of Union victory long before the guns fell silent. Then there was the telegraph, a web of wires stretching across the North like nervous tissue. Lincoln himself sat in the War Department, sending messages directly to his generals, something no leader had done before. It was the birth of real-time command. In contrast, Confederate communications often traveled by horseback, their orders arriving hours or days too late. A single misread telegram could mean thousands of lives lost. And the factories. Oh, the factories. Springfield, Massachusetts alone produced over 1 million rifles during the war. Northern foundries churned out ironclad ships, repeating rifles, even early machine guns like the Gatling, though they arrived too late to change much. The South, meanwhile, relied on scavenging, capturing Union weapons, melting down church bells for cannon, smuggling British rifles through blockades. Every Confederate bullet was a small miracle of improvisation. You picture the Union's massive armory at Watervliet, its furnaces roaring. Workers in soot-blackened aprons hammer cannon barrels with the precision of clockmakers. Sparks shower like stars, lighting the faces of boys too young to enlist, but old enough to shape the tools of war. They'll never see the battlefield, yet their fingerprints will be there on every weapon fired. The Confederacy's answer came from places like the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, its beating industrial heart. But Tredegar could never keep pace. Shortages haunted the South like ghosts. No iron for rails, no leather for boots, no salt for preserving meat. Soldiers went barefoot. Ammunition was rationed like gold. At one point, Confederate cavalrymen carried shotguns loaded with pebbles because they had no proper shells left. And yet, the South fought on, driven by ingenuity and sheer willpower. They built makeshift rail networks from torn-up city streets, repaired rifles with blacksmith tools, brewed gunpowder from bat droppings scraped off cave walls. Historians still debate whether this ingenuity proved their resilience or merely delayed the inevitable. You turn to another invisible weapon of the war: paper, money. The Union, with its strong banking system, issued greenbacks backed by the government's credit. Inflation came, but the economy held. The Confederacy, printing notes without backing, drowned in worthless currency. By 1865, a pair of boots could cost $300 Confederate dollars, if you could find them at all. It wasn't just economics. It was physics. The North could replace what it lost. The South could not. Every factory burned, every railroad cut, every crop field trampled, brought the Confederacy closer to starvation. By the end, Southern civilians were eating acorn soup and cornbread made with sawdust. And behind all this machinery of war stood something far stranger, a shift in scale. Before the Civil War, armies lived off the land. They moved like nomads, foraging as they went. But now, they were tethered to supply lines that stretched hundreds of miles. It took 50 tons of food per day to feed one army, and those tons came by train, wagon, and ship. The modern supply chain, impersonal, endless, unstoppable, was born here out of necessity. The result was paradoxical. The same technology that enabled mass destruction also demanded mass organization. Bureaucracy replaced heroics. Soldiers were no longer individuals. They were entries on manifests, crates of numbers moving through the system. The war became a machine, and America learned how to run it. A quirky story floats through the records. One Union quartermaster, drowning in paperwork, sent a sarcastic telegram to Washington reading, "Please stop the war for 3 days. We are out of forms." It's funny, until you realize it wasn't entirely a joke. The Civil War birthed the modern military bureaucracy, the same system that would one day supply millions across oceans. Still, for all its industrial might, the North's advantage was not purely mechanical. It was psychological. Every factory worker, every railroad engineer, every telegraph operator became part of the war effort. The entire society mobilized, blurring the line between civilian and soldier. The Confederacy tried to do the same, but its infrastructure simply couldn't carry the weight. The South had courage, the North had capacity. And in modern war, capacity wins. As you walk past the glowing furnaces of the Union heartland, the sound becomes hypnotic. Clanging metal, grinding gears, hissing steam. It feels less like a workshop and more like a heartbeat, mechanical and steady. You realize this is what victory sounds like. Not cheers or music, but the relentless rhythm of production. And somewhere far away, down in those muddy trenches, soldiers are firing bullets forged here, eating bread baked here, writing home on paper made here. They don't know the names of the people who keep them alive. They just know the supplies keep coming, and that's enough. When future historians talk about why the Union won, they'll mention Grant, Lincoln, and strategy. But the truth is simpler. The Union didn't just have more men, it had more everything. More iron, more food, more miles of track, more hands willing to work through the night. It was a nation learning how to turning fire and iron into survival. You look up at the smoke-filled sky and think, the war was fought on battlefields, but it was won in factories. And when the last cannon finally fell silent, the machine America built to destroy itself would become the same engine that built its future. You step away from the rail lines and the hammering foundries and back into the quiet of a small town somewhere far from the front, one of hundreds scattered across the battered United States in 1864. The streets are nearly empty. Church bells toll each week, not for services, but for funerals. The windows are shuttered, the paint is peeling, and the air feels heavy with waiting, because now the story shifts to the ones who never fired a shot, but who carried the war in their bones, the civilians. For every man in uniform, there were mothers, wives, children, and sisters holding the line in silence. The Civil War didn't just kill soldiers, it hollowed out towns, emptied farms, and rewrote the rhythm of everyday life. You walk past a general store in Ohio. Its shelves are half bare, sugar and flour rationed, cloth scarce, prices climbing. The storekeeper shrugs. All for the army, he says. In the North, factories hum, but so do rumors of loved ones dead, of draft riots, of rising taxes to pay for an endless war. Posters on the walls call for volunteers, but by now, most have already gone. The faces that remain are old men and small boys. Then you imagine the South. The scene there is worse. Entire plantations stripped of labor, fields overgrown, homes collapsing. Women plow the fields themselves, shoulders raw, their dresses soaked in sweat. The Confederate government issues paper money that loses value faster than it can be printed. Inflation becomes absurd. A pound of bacon for $50, a pair of shoes for $100. By the end, even the currency itself is worthless, used as kindling or wallpaper. One widow in Georgia writes in her diary, "We are living on boiled corn and faith." Another woman in Richmond notes that she traded her last silver spoon for salt. Historians still argue which side's civilians suffered more. The North endured its share of grief, the endless telegrams, the silent porches. But the South bore starvation and invasion. When Sherman's march to the sea came, it cut straight through the Confederacy's heart like a blade. His men tore up railroads, burned crops, seized livestock, and left behind fields of black ash. It wasn't just military strategy, it was psychological warfare. "War is cruelty," Sherman said. "The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over." You walk behind his ghostly columns now, through the remnants of once proud Georgian towns. The chimneys stand like gravestones. The locals call them Sherman's Sentinels. Livestock roam free where fences once stood. A farmer kneels in the dirt, sifting through the ashes of his barn, not cursing, not crying, just quiet. And yet, the march didn't break the South's will immediately. It broke something subtler, the illusion that civilians were safe. For centuries, war had drawn a line between soldier and bystander. The Civil War erased it. Now, homes were fair targets, food was a weapon, and survival depended on whose army passed through last. A peculiar detail: in some southern towns, women became the unofficial defenders. They hid food, smuggled messages, and even confronted soldiers directly. One Georgia woman reportedly scolded a Union officer for stealing her chickens, saying, "Sir, I'd sooner roast you." He laughed and left her 2 hens out of respect. War turns survival into theater sometimes. You pass through a hospital next, one of the countless temporary ones that sprang up in schools, churches, and hotels. Inside, nurses move among rows of cots. The smell of carbolic acid and blood mingles with candle wax. A mother reads aloud to her wounded son, her voice trembling on every word. A nurse dips rags in water, her hands raw from lye soap. These women, once told their place was in the home, have become the backbone of care. Clara Barton called them angels in gray and blue. One nurse writes in her letter, "We are all changed. None of us will ever be young again." In the North, the Sanitary Commission organized donations and relief supplies on an unprecedented scale. Bandages, blankets, medical instruments, and food, all collected by civilians. Entire towns participated in sanitary fairs, fundraisers that looked like festivals but smelled faintly of grief. It was war turned into civic duty, sorrow turned into work. Children too found ways to contribute. They picked lint for bandages, ran errands for hospitals, and learned geography by tracing battle maps with trembling fingers. Somewhere between arithmetic and spelling, they grew up watching fathers return without limbs, or not at all. The postal system became the emotional artery of the war. Thousands of letters crossed enemy lines each day, many carried by soldiers themselves. Some were love letters, others just desperate reassurances. One Union soldier wrote to his wife, "Do not worry if my hand trembles. It is the cannon, not fear." He died 2 weeks later at Cold Harbor. She received the letter months after the war ended. Even religion shifted. Preachers filled sermons with talk of divine justice, of suffering as purification. Churches doubled as recruiting stations, prayer meetings as political rallies. In the South, Faith was the last currency that didn't collapse. In the North, it was a fragile comfort against guilt. How could a nation so blessed tear itself apart? Then there were the enslaved people, millions who lived between both worlds, waiting for the tide to turn. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the words rippled through the South like a whisper at first, then a roar. Wherever Union troops advanced, enslaved men and women followed in their wake, seeking freedom and uncertain futures. They built camps near army lines, worked as laborers, nurses, scouts, and eventually, soldiers. By the end, nearly 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army. You see them now in your mind's eye, shoulders squared, wearing uniforms that still hang loose on their frames. They march not just for a flag, but for the right to exist under it. One freedman writes home, "I go to fight that my children may have a name other than slave." The South called them traitors. The North called them brothers, sometimes only on paper, but history called them indispensable. They didn't just help win the war, they gave it moral purpose. Meanwhile, on the home front, time itself seemed to slow. For every family that celebrated victory, another mourned quietly in a kitchen filled with empty chairs. Newspapers printed casualty lists so long that editors ran out of ink. Black mourning dresses became so common they were sold pre-sewn in general stores. A New England child reportedly asked her mother, "Why does everyone wear night?" And then there was the sound. Silence. No mail, no news, no knock on the door meant maybe he was still alive. Every woman learned to live inside that silence, counting days, whispering names into pillows. Historians still argue how a nation survived such grief without tearing apart completely. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it just stitched itself together roughly and called it healing. You step outside the hospital into the cold air and look up at the gray sky. Somewhere, far from here, generals are arguing and cannons are firing. But this quiet, is the real war's aftermath. The factories and trenches may decide who wins, but it's these small, unseen lives that decide who endures. You take one last look at the town, its windows dark, its streets empty, and think of all the ghosts who never wore uniforms but still carried the scars. The Civil War, you realize, wasn't fought on battlefields alone. It lived in kitchens, in prayers, in letters never answered. And for those left behind, peace would come, but not rest. The sound of morning bells fades behind you as you follow the path of retreating armies and burned fields into the final year of the war. By 1865, the air itself feels exhausted. The soldiers are gaunt, the horses skeletal, the uniforms little more than rags stitched with mud. The nation is bleeding out, and everyone knows it. You're in Virginia again, near Appomattox, and the forests smell of wet ash. The war has become a series of retreats, Confederate lines breaking one after another as supply trains vanish and roads turn to rivers of refugees. The Union Army, under Grant, keeps pressing forward. No more grand charges or desperate gambles, just slow, grinding pressure. You hear it in the letters now, the fatigue that seeps through every line. One Confederate soldier writes home, "We are too weak to fight, too proud to surrender." A Union private answers from another camp, "We march, we dig, we wait." Every mile we take feels heavier than the last. Historians still argue whether the war could have ended earlier if pride hadn't kept both sides fighting. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. The machinery was too big to stop. The railroads, the factories, the generals, the expectations, they all had their own momentum. You step through the ruins of Richmond, the Confederate capital, as Union troops enter the city in April 1865. Fires burn through the night, set by retreating soldiers to deny supplies to the enemy. The flames leap from building to building, devouring warehouses, homes, even churches. The sky glows orange like a second dawn. Civilians wander the streets in shock, clutching whatever they could carry. A woman holds a portrait of her husband, its glass cracked, but her grip steady. The Union soldiers don't cheer. They've seen too much for victory parades. One lieutenant writes, "We found no joy in the ruins, only silence." You walk past him, boots crunching on broken glass, and realize that every street here is lined with ghosts. Meanwhile, in the north, the mood is electric and uncertain. Word spreads that Lee has surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Crowds fill the streets of Washington, waving flags, singing patriotic hymns, embracing strangers. Lincoln appears at a window of the White House to address them, his voice soft but firm. "With malice toward none, with charity for all." For a moment, it feels like redemption might be possible, but history doesn't grant redemption so easily. 5 days later, Lincoln is dead, shot in a theater by a man who thought murder could rewrite the story. The crowds that had cheered now stand in stunned silence as his body is carried through the streets. One child asks her mother, "Is the war starting again?" You stand among them as the procession passes, the flags at half-mast, the air heavy with the smell of spring rain and grief. It's strange how quickly triumph can turn to mourning, how peace can arrive already draped in black. The war is over, but the wounds are open. 620,000 lives gone, perhaps more, so many that entire towns will never recover. Historians still debate the final number because so many men simply vanished, buried in unmarked graves, lost in hospital records, swallowed by rivers and fire. The soldiers who do return come home changed. Some have no limbs, some no eyes, some no words at all. They try to fit back into the world they left, but the world has changed without them. You can picture them limping through town squares, half saluted, half avoided, symbols of victory that no one knows how to celebrate. And for the freed people, those who walked away from bondage and into uncertain freedom, the war's end is both dawn and dusk. Across the South, they gather in fields and churchyards, singing, praying, shouting for joy. One man reportedly knelt in the dirt and said, "I thank the Lord, I am my own man." But freedom without safety is fragile. The years ahead will be filled with broken promises, laws twisted to keep them bound in new ways. Emancipation was written on paper. Equality was not yet born. You watch as Union officers oversee the reconstruction of the South, a noble word that hides an impossible task. How do you rebuild a country that just tried to kill itself? Towns need roads, railroads, schools, and courts. But more than that, they need trust, and there's none left. The old planter class clings to its pride, whispering of lost causes. Veterans form groups to preserve their memories, rewriting defeat into martyrdom. In the North, weary politicians argue over punishment versus mercy, while new industrialists quietly move on to railroads, coal, and expansion. The nation's energy shifts from mourning to money, from graves to growth. One Union general writes, "We buried the war, but we did not bury hate." And that hate will linger, on courthouse steps, in whispered resentments, in the shadows of monuments not yet built. You wander through an empty field in Tennessee, where the wildflowers have grown over the scars of old trenches. The breeze carries a faint, metallic scent, like rust and memory. Somewhere below, the bones of soldiers, blue and gray, lie together now, indistinguishable. The earth doesn't care who wore which color. A quirky detail: decades later, veterans from both sides would meet at Gettysburg reunions. Old men with white beards shaking hands over the same stone walls where they once tried to kill each other. Some wept, others laughed, and a few turned away, unable to look. Photographs show them side by side, but you can see in their eyes that the war never really left them. By the time the century turned, the Civil War had become myth. School books cleaned the blood from its pages. Songs softened its horror into nostalgia. Dixie and the Battle Hymn of the Republic were played at the same ceremonies, as if music could reconcile the irreconcilable. But for those who lived it, there was nothing romantic about it. It was a 4-year fever that burned through everything America thought it was, and left behind the scar of what it would become. Historians still debate the war's meaning. Was it fought for freedom or preservation? For ideals or for pride? Maybe it was all of those things. But standing here, watching the land grow green again, you can feel this simpler truth. It was fought because people couldn't agree on what it meant to be human in the same nation. You take one last look around. The war is over. The camps are gone, the trenches filled, the drums silent. But beneath every hill lies a chapter unfinished, a question unanswered. The Civil War didn't end with surrender. It simply changed its uniform and kept marching through history. And as you turn to leave, the wind rustles through the tall grass like a whisper. Remember us not for how we died, but for what we tried to build from the ashes. You walk away from the quiet fields of Appomattox and the flickering torches of morning parades, but the war follows you through time, through memory, through every echo that still lingers in the American voice. The Civil War is over on paper, yes, yet its shadow remains stitched into the nation's skin. It's easy to recite the numbers, 620,000 dead, or perhaps 750,000, depending on who's counting. But the scale is almost meaningless. Each number was a heartbeat. Each life left a silence that someone had to live inside. 1 in 4 soldiers never came home. And of those who did, half returned maimed in body or spirit. You stop beside a graveyard that stretches farther than the horizon. Neat white stones lined like the ghosts of regiments still standing at attention. The wind moves softly between them, whispering names that history has half forgotten. There's no difference now between Union and Confederate here, just rows of markers and the same inscription repeated endlessly. Unknown. The scale of that anonymity is staggering. So many dead that even counting them became an act of futility. Quartermasters recorded lists until the ink ran dry. Families sent letters to government offices begging for word of their missing sons. Some received bones in boxes, others nothing at all. One mother from Kentucky kept setting an extra plate at supper for a son who would never come home. When asked why, she said quietly, "I'd rather feed hope than bury it." Historians still argue how to measure the Civil War's true cost. Economists talk about inflation, debt, infrastructure. Demographers about lost generations. Philosophers about moral reckoning. But the simplest truth is that the war shattered something invisible. The belief that a nation could tear itself apart and ever truly heal again. You walk along the headstones and you can almost hear the hum of that vanished century. The rustle of camp tents, the roll of drums, the cough of musket fire carried on the wind. The same air that once held battle cries now carries only birdsong. It's peaceful, but not comforting. Peace, you realize, is just the absence of noise, not the absence of memory. When the soldiers went home, they carried the war with them. The nightmares, the phantom limbs, the sound of artillery still echoing in their bones. In towns across the country, the first veterans' homes opened, filled with men too broken to return to normal life. They sat on porches in tattered uniforms, staring at empty roads. One old Union soldier was asked what he missed most about the war. He thought for a moment and said, "Knowing what I was supposed to do each day." Even the land bore scars that refused to fade. Cannonballs buried deep beneath farms. Trenches turned into drainage ditches. Bullets melted into souvenirs. Farmers plowed up bones alongside potatoes. In some places, you could still smell sulfur in the soil when it rained. And yet, from all that ruin, something strange grew: memory. In the years that followed, both sides began to tell stories, some true, some less so. The South spoke of gallantry, of a lost cause that sanctified defeat. The North framed the war as moral triumph, the final test of democracy. Neither story captured the whole truth, but both offered comfort. That's what memory does. It edits until the unbearable becomes survivable. Every Memorial Day, the process repeats. Flags flutter over graves, bugles play taps, children recite speeches they only half understand. The old wounds reopen quietly, then close again for another year. Historians still debate whether America ever truly reconciled or merely agreed to forget in parallel. Perhaps both, but here's the paradox. In its horror, the Civil War also gave birth to modern America. It transformed a fragile republic into a centralized nation. It abolished slavery, redefining freedom not as inheritance but as right. It jump-started medicine, logistics, and technology. It introduced national cemeteries, income tax, military pensions, and the idea that government could and must hold moral authority. It even accelerated language. New words entered the lexicon: dog tag, trench, draft, sharpshooter, casualty. Progress and tragedy are terrible twins. One never arrives without the other. You walk through one of those new cemeteries where marble headstones gleam under a fading sunset. Nearby stands a monument inscribed with a line from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, that these dead shall not have died in vain. The letters catch the light, and you think about what he meant. Did he foresee that even victory would feel hollow? That the cost of preserving a nation would be so high it nearly destroyed the soul of it? A century and a half later, historians still argue over interpretation. Was the war about slavery or states' rights? About power or morality? You could say it was about all of them, woven together until they became inseparable. Wars don't start with single reasons. They start when too many small truths collide. And yet, for all its complexity, one truth remains painfully simple. The Civil War taught America how deadly progress could be when humanity lags behind its inventions. Disease and firepower, pride and politics, they all conspired to prove that modernization without mercy turns soldiers into statistics and nations into graveyards. The last light fades. Crickets begin to sing. The war's ghosts seem to exhale, their stories told for one more night. You look out over the field where the grass moves gently in the wind and think about the families who never got closure, the doctors who learned medicine through agony, the engineers who built the first railroads to carry death, and the soldiers who believed, until their final breath, that they were dying for something sacred. Maybe they were right, maybe they were wrong. Historians still argue, but as you stand here, surrounded by quiet rows of marble and whispers of gunfire carried through history, the distinction feels irrelevant. What matters is that they were human, fragile, stubborn, and brave enough to march into an unknowable future. You close your eyes. The air is still, the earth steady beneath your feet. For a brief moment, you can almost feel the pulse of the nation as it was, aching, grieving, but alive. And you whisper a final prayer for the fallen, not of victory or defeat, but of rest. So now, as the fires die and the night air cools, you lean back and let the noise of that century drift away. The cannons fall silent. The bugles fade into memory. You're left with the hush that always follows great storms, the kind of silence that feels almost holy. It's strange, isn't it, how the past never really ends? You can still hear it in the distance, the faint drumbeat of marching boots, the rustle of flags, the quiet weeping of those left behind. History doesn't vanish, it settles, layer by layer, into the soil, waiting for someone to listen. Tonight, you did. You trace the outline of what this war left behind. A nation reshaped, a people humbled, and a lesson still unfinished. The Civil War proved that even the most advanced weapons can't civilize cruelty, and that progress without compassion is just another form of destruction. Yet, somehow, from all that loss came renewal, the slow rebuilding of unity, the stubborn endurance of hope. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them. The voices of the ordinary soldiers, the nurses, the mothers, the freedmen, all whispering the same plea. Remember us truly, not kindly. The stars stretch above the old battlefields now, indifferent and eternal. The same constellations that watch the soldiers die still watch you tonight, And maybe that's the quiet mercy of it, that life keeps going, even after history forgets our names. So breathe in. Let the last echoes fade. The past has spoken, and you have listened. And as you drift toward sleep, may the lessons of their pain soften something in you, a gentleness strong enough to keep what they fought for alive. Sweet dreams.